There's a guy I know, sharp, well-spoken, knows his product inside and out. He walks into every meeting armed with a pitch deck, a rehearsed script, and an almost surgical ability to handle objections. He does everything the sales training books tell you to do, and he closes about one deal in 15. Then there's someone else I've watched. She walks into the same kind of meeting, barely talks about the product for the first 20 minutes. She asks questions, real questions, about the client's situation, their frustrations, what they've already tried. Sometimes she doesn't even get to the pitch. Sometimes the client asks her, "So what do you actually offer?" And when she finally explains, the client leans in. She closes about 1 in 3, same market, same type of product, wildly different results. Why? Because one of them is selling. And the other one is doing something that looks nothing like selling on the surface, but is in fact the highest form of it. Here's the uncomfortable truth that most people in sales, and honestly, most people trying to build a career, a business, or even a personal brand, get completely wrong. The act of trying to sell is often the very thing that prevents the sale from happening. And I don't mean that in some abstract, motivational poster way. I mean there is a specific neurological and psychological mechanism that explains why pushing harder makes people pull away, and why the people who seem to sell effortlessly aren't effortless at all. They're just operating on a completely different level. Let me break this apart. Most people think selling is about persuasion. You learn the features, you memorize the benefits, you anticipate the objections, and then you deliver your message with enough confidence and urgency that the other person says yes. That's the model most sales training is built on, and it's not entirely wrong, but it's dangerously incomplete. Here's where it goes sideways. When you walk into a conversation with the primary intent to persuade, your body language shifts. Your listening becomes selective. You're not hearing what the other person is saying. You're scanning for openings to insert your pitch. Your questions aren't real questions, they're setups, and the person across from you can feel it. They may not be able to articulate what's happening, but something in the interaction feels off. They get guarded. They start giving shorter answers. They say things like, "Let me think about it," or "Send me some materials and I'll review them." A translation: "I don't trust this interaction and I need distance." Now here's the part most people miss. This isn't just psychology. There's actual neural machinery driving this reaction. When a human being senses that someone is trying to influence them, trying to steer the conversation toward a predetermined outcome, the amygdala activates. The amygdala is the brain's threat detection system. It doesn't distinguish between a physical threat and a social one. It just registers. Something here is not safe. And when the amygdala fires, it does two things simultaneously. First, it floods the body with cortisol and adrenaline, stress hormones that shift the entire system into a defensive posture. Second, and this is critical, it suppresses activity in the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is where rational decision-making lives. It's where a person weighs options, considers long-term value, evaluates trust. The exact cognitive functions you need your client to be using when they're deciding whether to work with you, those functions get dialed down the moment they feel pushed. So think about what's actually happening in most sales interactions. The salesperson is trying harder and harder to be convincing, and with every increase in pressure, the client's brain is literally shutting down its ability to say yes rationally. The salesperson is working against the neurology of the person they're trying to help. It's like trying to fill a cup while someone is holding their hand over it. This is why the best salespeople look like they're not selling. Let me put this in a sharper frame. The core insight is this: selling is not about getting someone to say yes. Selling is about removing the reasons they would say no, including the ones they can't articulate. Most of the reasons a deal falls apart aren't logical. They're limbic. The client felt rushed. The client felt like a target. The client sensed that the salesperson cared more about the commission than about their problem. The client couldn't explain why, but something felt transactional. These aren't intellectual objections. These are threat responses, and you cannot overcome a threat response with a better slide deck. This maps directly onto something Naval Ravikant talks about when he discusses specific knowledge and leverage. Naval's argument is that the most valuable people in any economy are those who possess knowledge that cannot be trained for knowledge that comes from genuine experience, genuine curiosity, and genuine understanding. In sales, that specific knowledge is the ability to read a room, to sense what someone actually needs versus what they're saying they need, to know when to push forward and when to sit in silence. You can't learn that from a script. You learn it from thousands of conversations where you paid real attention. And here's the leverage part. When you develop that level of understanding, every conversation you have carries more weight. You're not grinding through 50 cold calls hoping to get lucky. You're walking into 10 conversations and closing 4 of them because you're not wasting anyone's time, including your own. You're operating with what Naval would call judgment, the ability to make decisions that compound over time. Each relationship you build correctly becomes a node in a network that feeds itself. Each client who feels genuinely understood becomes a referral source, a repeat buyer, a long-term asset. That's compound interest applied to human relationships. And it's the only sustainable way to build a sales career, or, honestly, any career. Charlie Munger would look at this from the other direction. Munger's entire philosophy is built on inversion. Instead of asking, "How do I succeed?" ask, "What would guarantee failure, and how do I avoid that?" In sales, the guaranteed path to failure is making every interaction about you. Your quota, your product, your timeline, your need to close. The moment the conversation centers on your agenda, you've already lost. Because the other person's brain has registered that this is not a collaboration, it's an extraction. And people resist extraction with everything they've got, even when the product would genuinely help them. Munger also talks about psychological misjudgments, the systematic ways human beings fool themselves. One of the most relevant here is what he calls the reward and punishment superresponse tendency. In plain language, people are exquisitely sensitive to incentives, and they can detect when your incentives are misaligned with theirs. When a salesperson is clearly motivated by hitting a number rather than solving a problem. So if the traditional model of selling, persuade, overcome, close, is neurologically counterproductive, what actually works? This is where I want to get specific because this isn't theory. This is practice. The first shift is from persuasion to comprehension. Not, how do I get them to see it my way? But do I actually understand what their situation looks like from the inside? These are fundamentally different orientations. The first one treats the client as an obstacle to be navigated. The second treats them as a landscape to be understood. And that difference changes everything: your body language, your questions, your energy, your patience. When you're genuinely trying to understand someone, something interesting happens in your own neurology. Your mirror neuron system activates. Mirror neurons are the brain cells that fire both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing that action. They're the neural basis for empathy, not empathy in the greeting card sense, but empathy as a computational process, your brain literally modeling the internal state of another person. When your mirror neuron system is fully engaged, you start picking up on subtleties, micro-expressions, shifts in tone, hesitations that you would completely miss if you were focused on your own agenda. And here's the reciprocal effect. When you're genuinely attuned to someone, they can feel it. Not because of anything mystical, because when your mirror neurons are active, your behavior subtly synchronizes with theirs, your speech rhythm, your posture, your emotional tone. This synchronization is one of the most powerful trust signals in human interaction. It tells the other person's brain, this individual is not a threat. This individual is with me, not against me. And when that signal registers, the amygdala quiets down, the prefrontal cortex comes back online, and the person across from you is now neurologically capable of making a rational decision. This is what I mean when I say the best salespeople manage the neurological state of their clients. They're not manipulating. They're creating the conditions under which a genuine decision can happen. There's a world of difference between those two things. Manipulation tries to bypass someone's judgment. Now let me connect this to something bigger, because this isn't just about sales. We're living in an era where everyone, not just people with the word sales in their job title, needs to be able to communicate their value. If you're a freelancer, you're selling your skills. If you're applying for a job, you're selling your potential. If you're building a company, you're selling your vision. If you're trying to get a raise, get promoted, find a business partner, attract investors, or even build a meaningful personal network, you are selling. You're selling ideas, credibility, trustworthiness, competence, and the same neurological principles apply in every one of those contexts. The person across the table, whether it's a client, a hiring manager, an investor, or a potential collaborator, is always running the same unconscious calculation. Is this person trying to extract from me or create with me? That's the fork, that's the decision point. And you cannot fake being on the creative side of that fork. You can only actually be on it. This connects to something I think about a lot in terms of the Talmudic tradition of business ethics. There's a principle in the Talmud that a transaction is only valid if both parties benefit. Not just legally valid, morally valid. A deal where one side wins and the other loses is considered a form of theft, even if no laws were broken. That's a radical idea if you really sit with it. It means that the salesperson's job is not just to close the deal, it's to make sure the deal is genuinely good for the other person. And paradoxically, when you operate from that principle, you close more deals, not fewer, because people can sense when you're looking out for them, and that's when they open up. I've experienced this directly. There have been conversations where, after understanding what someone actually needed, I told them my solution wasn't the right fit. I recommended something else, and you know what happened? Half of those people came back to me later with a different need that I could help with. Some of them referred me to other people. The short-term loss became a long-term gain, not because I was strategically playing the long game, but because I was being honest. And honesty, it turns out, is the most efficient sales strategy that exists. Not because it's noble, because it compounds. Let me give you a specific scenario to make this concrete. Imagine you're a consultant. Let's say you help small businesses improve their operations. You get a meeting with a company that's struggling with employee retention. They've heard about your services, and they want to know what you can do. Now the traditional approach. You walk in, you present your framework, you show case studies, you give them a proposal, and you push for a decision timeline. Here's what actually works better. You walk in and you say almost nothing about your framework for the first 30 minutes. Instead, you ask questions. Not surface questions, deep, structural questions. When did you first notice retention becoming a problem? What have you already tried? What happened when you tried those things? If I talked to one of your employees who recently left, what do you think they would tell me? What's the cost of replacing one person in your most critical role? Here's what you're doing with those questions. First, you're gathering real information that will allow you to give them something genuinely useful, not a generic pitch. Second, you're demonstrating competence without claiming it. The quality of your questions tells them more about your expertise than any slide deck ever could. Third, you're letting them hear their own answers. Often, the client knows what's wrong. They just haven't been asked the right questions by someone who's truly listening. When they articulate the problem out loud in their own words, the solution becomes obvious to them. And when the solution is obvious to them, they don't feel sold. They feel understood. And understood is the most powerful emotional state a client can be in when it comes to making a buying decision. There's a neuroscience term for this: the reticular activating system, or RAS. The RAS is a network of neurons in the brainstem that filters incoming information based on relevance. It's why you notice your car everywhere after you buy it. It's why, when you're hungry, you suddenly see every restaurant on the street. The RAS determines what gets through to conscious awareness. When you ask someone a powerful question, a question that makes them reframe their own problem, you're essentially reprogramming their RAS. You're changing what they pay attention to. And once they start paying attention to the real problem instead of the surface symptoms, they naturally start looking for the real solution. If you're the person who helped them see clearly, you're already their first choice. You didn't have to persuade them. You helped them persuade themselves. This is also where the concept of focused versus diffuse thinking comes in, from learning science. When someone is, now here's where I have to be honest about something because I think it matters. I'm not talking about this from some ivory tower. I'm in the middle of this work myself. I build tools, AI-powered systems that help salespeople grow. Not grow in the sense of learn more closing tricks. Grow in the sense of building the internal architecture that makes great selling possible. The resilience to handle rejection without it corroding your self-worth. The perceptiveness to pick up on what a client is really saying underneath their words. The discipline to follow up, to reflect, to analyze what went right and what went wrong in every single interaction. Every topic I cover in these conversations comes from something I'm actually working through. Because here's the thing about sales, and this applies to the broadest definition of sales, not just selling products. The best way to teach something is to be in the process of learning it deeply yourself. Not to have it figured out, not to pretend you've arrived, but to be in the active struggle of getting better and to share what you're discovering along the way. That's honest. And as I just spent 10 minutes explaining, honesty is the infrastructure that everything else is built on. Let me go deeper into the practice side of this, because knowing the theory changes nothing if you don't know how to train it. The concept of deliberate practice, originally from K. Anders Ericsson's research and popularized in various forms, is usually applied to musicians, athletes, chess players. But it applies to sales with equal force, maybe more, because the feedback loops in sales are longer and less obvious. Here's what deliberate practice in a sales context actually looks like. First, every conversation needs a post-mortem. Not a vague, that went well or that went badly. A specific reconstruction. What did I ask? What did they say? Where did their energy shift? At what point did they become more engaged or more guarded? What question did I ask that opened something up? What statement did I make that shut something down? This level of analysis is uncomfortable. Most people avoid it because it forces you to confront the gap between how you think you showed up and how you actually showed up. But that gap is where all the growth lives. Second, you need to practice at the edge of your ability, not in the comfort zone. If you're great at building rapport but weak at transitioning to a concrete next step, you don't practice building rapport, you already know how to do that. You practice the transition, you role-play it, you rehearse it, you have someone push back and you figure out how to hold your ground without becoming pushy. This is edge training. It's the only kind of practice that produces genuine improvement. Everything else is just repetition, which feels productive but isn't. Third, feedback has to be specific and immediate. This is where most salespeople fail. They operate in a vacuum. They have a call, they move on, they have another call. There's no reflection loop. No one is watching the tape. No one is asking, why did you say that at minute 7? In my own work, this is exactly why I built an AI system that can do this kind of analysis, because most salespeople don't have a coach sitting next to them on every call. But they do have the ability to reconstruct the conversation afterward, feed it into a system that can identify patterns and get actionable feedback. The point isn't the technology. The point is the feedback loop. However you create it, with a mentor, a peer, a journal, a recording, an AI, the loop has to exist. Without it, you're just accumulating experience without accumulating learning, and those are two very different things. Charlie Munger has a phrase for this: experience. Here's another dimension of this that people rarely talk about, and it's crucial. The fear of selling, the discomfort most people feel around sales, is not primarily a skill problem, it's an identity problem. Most people associate selling with manipulation, with being pushy, with being that annoying person at the party who's always working an angle. And because they have that association, every time they're in a position where they need to sell their ideas, their work, their value, they unconsciously sabotage themselves. They undersell, they apologize for the price, they bury the ask, they give everything away for free because charging money feels dirty. They talk about their product in vague, non-committal terms because committing fully feels too aggressive. This is a neural pattern. The brain has associated selling with social threat, the threat of being perceived as manipulative, pushy, or self-serving. And because social rejection triggers the same neural circuits as physical pain, this is well-documented research from Naomi Eisenberger's lab at UCLA. The brain avoids selling the same way it avoids touching a hot stove. The way to rewire this isn't to pump yourself up with confidence affirmations. Affirmations don't work on deep neural patterns. What works is reframing the identity, and the reframe is this: selling, done correctly, is an act of service. You have something that can help someone. If you don't tell them about it, you're not being humble, you're being selfish. You're prioritizing your own comfort over their benefit. That's the inversion. The discomfort you feel about selling is actually a form of self-centeredness disguised as modesty, because it's all about how you feel, how you'll be perceived, whether you'll be judged. It has nothing to do with the other person. When you flip that, when you make it about whether the other person's life or business would be better with what you're offering, the entire emotional architecture shifts. It doesn't become easy overnight, but the direction changes. You start moving toward the conversation instead of away from it, and that's enough to begin the rewiring process. This is consistent with what the Talmudic tradition calls the principle of creating prosperity for others as a path to your own. It's not a charity argument, it's a systems argument. When you consistently create value for others, real value, not performative value, you become a node that people root through. Opportunities flow toward you because you've demonstrated that transactions with you are positive sum. This isn't mysticism. This is network dynamics. The people who create the most value attract the most opportunities. Not because the universe is rewarding them, because humans are rational enough to notice who makes things better and who makes things worse, and they adjust their behavior accordingly. Let me talk about a trap that catches even experienced salespeople because it's subtle and it's deadly. The trap is knowing what to do but not doing it consistently. You've probably had this experience. You read something, you hear something in a podcast, you have an insight in a conversation, and you think, yes, that's exactly right, I need to do that. And then 3 days later, you're right back to your old patterns, not because you forgot. Because the old pattern is neurologically cheaper. This is the difference between declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge. Declarative knowledge is knowing that you should listen more and talk less. Procedural knowledge is actually listening more and talking less in a live conversation when your adrenaline is up and you're afraid of losing the deal. These live in different parts of the brain. Declarative knowledge is stored in the neocortex. It's conscious, explicit, easy to access. Procedural knowledge is built through repetition in the basal ganglia and cerebellum. It's automatic, implicit, and can only be developed through practice. You can't shortcut it. This is why reading sales books doesn't make you better at sales. Reading is declarative. Selling is procedural. You have to do the reps. You have to have the conversations. You have to fail, reflect, adjust, and try again. There is no other path, and the people who accept this, who stop looking for the insight that will change everything and instead commit to the daily grind of incremental improvement, are the ones who eventually become exceptional. Not because they're more talented, because they've logged the hours of deliberate, reflective practice that wires the skills into automatic behavior. The dopamine system in the brain plays a crucial role here, and most people misunderstand it. Dopamine is not a reward chemical, it's an anticipation chemical. It fires in response to expected future reward, not current reward. This means that if you're constantly chasing the next big insight, the next sales hack, the next game-changing strategy, you're getting dopamine hits from the anticipation of improvement, not from actual improvement. Your brain feels like progress is happening because dopamine makes everything feel imminent and exciting, but nothing is actually changing. This is the neurological basis of the self-help consumption trap. You feel like you're growing because you're always reading, always watching, always learning. But real growth happens in the gap between what you consume and what you execute. And that gap is where most people live their entire lives without crossing. The way to redirect the dopamine system is to attach anticipation to the practice itself, not to the outcome. Don't set goals like, I will close 5 deals this month. Instead, set process goals. I will conduct 3 post-mortem analyses this week. I will ask at least. There's one more layer I want to address because it's the one that ties everything together. A lot of people hear advice like, don't try to sell, try to understand, and they interpret it as, be passive, be agreeable. Don't challenge the client, just nod and listen and hope they decide to buy. That's not what I'm saying. At all. Understanding is not passive. Understanding is the most active thing you can do in a conversation. It requires you to hold multiple models in your head simultaneously. What the client is saying, what they might mean, what they're afraid of, what they actually need versus what they think they need, what their constraints are, what their decision-making process looks like, who else is involved in the decision, what happened the last time they tried to solve this problem. Holding all of that while staying present, asking the right question at the right moment, and knowing when to share your perspective and when to hold it, that's not passive. That's the most demanding cognitive work there is. And there is a moment, if you've done the understanding work correctly, where you do make your case. You do present your solution. You do ask for the commitment, but by that point, it doesn't feel like a pitch. It feels like the natural next step in a conversation that's been building toward clarity. The client isn't being convinced. The client is arriving at a conclusion that you help them reach through a genuine process of exploration. This is the difference between what I'd call mechanical selling and organic selling. Mechanical selling follows a script: qualify, present, handle objections, close. Organic selling follows the client. Understand their world, identify the real problem, explore whether you can help, and if so, explain how in language that maps to their specific situation. Both approaches can close deals, but mechanical selling creates customers. Organic selling creates relationships, and in any business, any career, relationships are the asset that appreciates while everything else depreciates. Naval talks about this in terms of compound interest applied to relationships. Every genuine relationship you build is an investment that grows over time. The client you helped solve a problem today becomes the referral source 5 years from now. The person you didn't sell, because you honestly told them your solution wasn't right for them, remembers your integrity and brings you a bigger opportunity later. You can't predict when these returns will come. But if you consistently invest in genuine understanding and honest communication, they come. They always come. Not because of cosmic justice, because of human memory and reciprocity, which are among the most reliable forces in social life. Let me bring this to a very concrete place. If you're watching this and you sell for a living, or if you're anyone who needs to communicate your value to others, which is everyone, Here's what I'd suggest you do this week, not next month. This week, 1. Record your next 3 conversations, not to judge yourself, to study yourself. Listen back and count how many of your questions were genuine questions versus setups for your pitch. How many seconds did you let the other person speak before you jumped in? At what point in the conversation did you stop listening and start waiting for your turn to talk? Be honest, the number will probably surprise you. 2. Before your next meeting, write down 3 things you genuinely do not know about the person you're meeting with. Not things you can Google, things you can only learn by asking. Their real frustration, their hidden constraint, their actual decision-making criteria. Then go into the meeting with the sole intent of learning those 3 things. Don't worry about pitching. Don't worry about closing. Just learn. See what happens to the quality of the conversation. 3. At the end of each day this week, write 1 paragraph, just 1, about the best question you asked and the best question you wish you had asked. Over time, this builds a personal library of high-quality questions. And the quality of your questions determines the quality of your career. Full stop. 4. Identify 1 thing you're avoiding in your sales process, 1 conversation, 1 follow-up, 1 ask that makes you uncomfortable, and do it. Not because it will feel good. It won't. Do it because avoidance is the single most expensive habit in sales. Every conversation you don't have is a relationship that doesn't exist. And every relationship that doesn't exist is compound interest you're leaving on the table. 5. Ask yourself this. In my last 10 interactions, here's what I've come to believe after years of doing this work, after building systems designed to help salespeople grow, after reading everything from neuroscience papers to ancient commercial wisdom, and after having thousands of conversations where I was the one trying to understand and the one needing to be understood. Selling is not a technique you apply to other people. It's a capacity you develop inside yourself, the capacity to understand deeply, communicate clearly, and create value that both sides can recognize. The people who are great at this don't think of themselves as salespeople. They think of themselves as problem solvers who happen to get paid when the problem is worth solving, and the ones who never get there. They're still looking for the perfect pitch, still rehearsing the killer close, still trying to find the right words that will make someone say yes. They'll spend their whole career pushing against the neurology of the people they're trying to help. And they'll never understand why it's so hard. It's hard because they're facing the wrong direction. Stop trying to sell. Start trying to understand. The sales will follow, not because you willed them into existence, but because understanding is the only foundation that trust can be built on. And trust is the only currency that never inflates. If this landed with you, share your perspective in the comments or on your own page. I want to know, when was the last time you